Sometimes life doesn't just knock you down, it takes everything you've built and leaves you starting over with nothing. At 54, Drake Ramoray was living in a tent on a mountain trail, alone and forgotten by the world he once knew. He had lost his job, his home, and his family had stopped calling. Every day was about survival, finding food, staying warm, and trying not to think about how he ended up here. Then a stray dog appeared. The dog kept coming back, quiet and calm, like it knew something Drake didn't. One day, it led him up a narrow trail to a hidden cave. Inside, Drake found something that would change everything, but could it really give him a second chance? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Drake Ramoray woke to the sound of rain drumming against canvas, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm, feeling the dampness seeping through the thin fabric of his sleeping bag. The tent was small, barely large enough for him to stretch out, and it sagged in places where the poles had begun to bend under months of use. Outside, the world was grey and cold, the kind of autumn morning that promised winter wasn't far behind. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. 54 years old, and some mornings he felt every single one of those years pressing down on him. His back ached from sleeping on the hard ground, despite the foam pad he'd salvaged from a dumpster behind a sporting goods store months ago. He rubbed his face, feeling the thick beard that had grown wild and unkempt. There was no mirror here, no reason to care what he looked like. No one was looking anyway. The routine was always the same. Drake pulled on his jacket, a heavy canvas work coat that had seen better days, and crawled out of the tent into the drizzle. The campsite was tucked into a small clearing about 30 yards off the Glacier Ridge Trail, hidden by a dense stand of pine trees. He'd chosen the spot carefully when he'd first come here 6 months ago. Remote enough that hikers wouldn't stumble across him, close enough to the trail that he could walk to the stream for water without getting completely lost. He stretched, wincing at the pull in his lower back, and looked around at what had become his world. A fire pit ringed with stones, cold and wet now. A tarp strung between 2 trees to create a small shelter for his gear. A rope line where he hung clothes to dry when the sun decided to show itself. Everything he owned in the world fit in this 20-foot circle of dirt and pine needles. It hadn't always been this way. Drake walked to the stream, carrying 2 plastic gallon jugs he'd found along the highway. The water was cold and clear, running fast from recent rains higher up the mountain. He filled both jugs, his hands going numb in the icy current, and carried them back to camp. Water for drinking, water for washing, water for cooking the meager meals he cobbled together from whatever he could find or afford. There was a time when he'd been a construction foreman, running crews that built homes and commercial buildings across western Montana. He'd been good at his work, respected by the men who worked under him, trusted by the contractors who hired him. He'd made decent money, enough to rent a small house in Kalispell, enough to help his ex-wife with expenses even after the divorce, enough to feel like a man who had his life together. That was before the economy shifted, before the construction company started laying off workers, before they told him at 52 that they were restructuring and his position was being eliminated. They'd given him 2 weeks severance and a handshake, and he'd walked out of that office knowing that no one was going to hire a 52-year-old foreman when they could get someone younger for less money. He'd tried. God knows he'd tried. Sent out resumes, made phone calls, showed up at job sites offering to work as regular crew. But the market was flooded with younger men desperate for work, and Drake's grey hair and worn hands marked him as yesterday's news. The savings ran out faster than he'd expected. The rent came due, and then came due again, and then his landlord started leaving notes on the door. Within 6 months he was evicted. His ex-wife had remarried by then, moved to Bozeman with her new husband. His daughter Claire was 28, working as a physical therapist in Seattle, building her own life. His son Noah was 25, Doing something with computers in Portland. Drake wasn't entirely sure what, but it sounded impressive whenever Noah tried to explain it. Both of them had offered help at first, but Drake's pride wouldn't let him take it. They were just starting out, trying to establish themselves. They didn't need their father dragging them down. So he'd stopped answering their calls, stopped returning their messages, let the phone go dead when he couldn't pay the bill. He told himself it was better this way, easier for everyone if he just disappeared. They could tell people their father lived somewhere out west, keep it vague, not have to admit he was sleeping in a tent in the woods like some kind of vagrant. The word stung even in his own mind: vagrant, homeless, street person. None of the labels fit the image he'd carried of himself his entire adult life. But here he was, proving that pride and self-image didn't count for much when you couldn't make rent. Drake spent the morning doing what he did every morning. He sorted through his supplies, taking inventory of what little food he had left. 3 cans of beans, a half-empty jar of peanut butter, some stale crackers in a Ziploc bag. He'd need to hike into town soon, maybe see if the food bank was open, maybe check the dumpsters behind the grocery store after dark. The thought made his stomach turn, but hunger had a way of stripping away dignity. He checked his gear, looking for damage from the weather. The tent had a new tear along one seam. He'd need to patch that before it got worse. His boots were holding up barely, but the sole on the left one was starting to separate. He had duct tape for that, had wrapped the boot 3 times already. Everything was about making do, making things last, stretching one more day out of items that should have been replaced months ago. Around midday, the rain stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the pine trees. Drake gathered kindling and tried to start a fire, but everything was too wet. He gave up after 10 minutes and ate a cold meal of peanut butter on crackers, sitting on a fallen log and staring at nothing in particular. This was his life now. Wake up, get water, eat something, fix something, walk around to stay warm, eat something else, try to sleep, repeat. Day after day, week after week, month after month. He'd become a ghost, haunting this little patch of mountain, visible to no one, mattering to no one. He thought about his children sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the darkness pressed in close. He wondered if they thought about him, if they worried, if they'd tried to find him. He wondered if they were angry at him for disappearing, or if they were relieved not to have to deal with his failure. The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and he had no answers for any of them. The afternoon stretched long and empty. Drake walked the trail for a while, just to move, just to feel like he had somewhere to go. He saw a few hikers in the distance, young couples with expensive gear and bright smiles, and he stepped off the path before they could see him. He didn't want their pity or their fear or their questions. When he returned to camp, he noticed something unusual. A dog sat at the edge of the clearing, watching him. It was medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, with a shaggy coat that looked like a mix of several breeds. The fur was brown and grey, matted in places, and the dog had intelligent eyes that tracked Drake's movements without fear or aggression. It just sat there, calm and patient, as if waiting for something. Drake stopped walking. "Hey there," he said quietly. The dog's ears perked up, but it didn't move. Drake took a step forward. The dog stood but didn't back away. They regarded each other across the clearing, 2 creatures alone in the woods, sizing each other up. "You lost?" Drake asked, though he knew the dog couldn't answer. He looked around for any sign of owners, listened for voices calling for a missing pet, but heard nothing except the wind in the pines and the distant sound of water rushing over rocks. The dog sat down again. Drake went about his business, aware of the animal watching him. He gathered more wood for the fire attempt he'd make that evening, organized his supplies, checked the weather by looking at the sky. The whole time, the dog stayed at the edge of the clearing, never coming closer, never leaving. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Drake sat on his log and looked at the dog. "You planning on staying?" he asked. The dog tilted its head. Drake pulled out a can of beans, opened it with his pocket knife, and ate half cold. He set the can down on the ground, closer to the dog than to himself. "If you're hungry, help yourself." The dog looked at the can but didn't approach. After a few minutes, Drake went into his tent, crawled into his sleeping bag, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day of the same. Wake up, survive, sleep. That was the pattern now. That was all there was. But outside, the dog remained, sitting guard in the darkness, as if it knew something Drake didn't yet understand. As if it had come for a reason. The dog came back the next morning. Drake crawled out of his tent to find it sitting in the exact same spot, as if it had never left. The can of beans was still where he'd placed it, untouched. The dog watched him with those calm, intelligent eyes, and Drake felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. "You're stubborn," Drake said. He went through his morning routine, and the dog watched every movement. When Drake walked to the stream for water, the dog followed at a distance, maintaining the same careful space between them. When he returned to camp, the dog settled back into its watching position. 3 days passed like this. The dog appeared every morning, kept its distance, and observed. Drake tried different approaches. He spoke to it softly, telling stories about his life, about the buildings he'd helped construct, about his children when they were young. He left food crackers, bits of jerky he'd bartered for in town, even half his dinner one night. The dog never touched any of it. "What do you want?" Drake asked on the 3rd evening, frustrated and strangely moved by this creature's persistence. "Why do you keep coming back?" The dog just watched, as if the answer should be obvious. On the 4th day, everything changed. Drake woke to an unusual stillness. The air felt heavy, pregnant with moisture, and the sky was the color of old bruises. He'd lived outside long enough to recognize the signs. A serious storm was coming, the kind that could drop several inches of rain and turn the mountain trails into rivers of mud. He needed to prepare. The tent wasn't in the best shape, and if the storm was as bad as it looked, he'd spend a miserable night trying to keep dry. He set to work, reinforcing the tent stakes, checking the rain fly, moving his supplies under the tarp where they'd have some protection. The dog appeared earlier than usual, and its behavior was different. Instead of settling into its usual spot, it paced at the edge of the clearing, restless and agitated. It would look up the trail, then back at Drake, then up the trail again. "I'm busy," Drake muttered, wrestling with a tent rope that refused to cooperate. "Storm's coming, and I need to—" The dog barked. It was the first sound the animal had made in 4 days, and it startled Drake so much he dropped the rope. The bark wasn't aggressive or fearful, it was insistent, demanding attention. Drake turned to look at the dog. It stood at the trail entrance, body tense, staring up the slope. "What is it?" The dog barked again, then took several steps up the trail. It stopped and looked back at Drake, waiting. "I don't have time for games," Drake said. But there was something in the dog's posture, something urgent and deliberate, that made him pause. The dog walked farther up the trail, stopped again, looked back. Drake stood there, torn between the practical need to secure his camp and the inexplicable pull of the dog's behavior. The animal wasn't playing. It was trying to tell him something, show him something. He looked at the sky. The storm wouldn't hit for another hour or 2. His camp was as secure as it was going to get. "This better be worth it," Drake said, grabbing his flashlight and his jacket. The dog's tail wagged once, the first time Drake had seen it show any emotion beyond calm patience, and then it turned and headed up the trail. Drake followed. The path was narrow and rocky, climbing steadily higher into the ridge. Drake had hiked portions of it before, usually when he needed to move around to stay warm or clear his head, but he'd never gone this far. The dog moved with purpose, not rushing but maintaining a steady pace, checking back frequently to ensure Drake was still behind. They climbed for 20 minutes, maybe more. Drake's legs burned with the effort, and his breath came harder. He was in decent shape for a man his age, kept strong by the physical demands of survival, but this was a serious ascent. The trees thinned out, giving way to more exposed rock face, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. "Where are you taking me?" Drake called out, but the dog just kept moving. Finally, they reached a section of the trail where the rock face jutted out in a steep wall. The dog stopped and looked at Drake, then walked directly toward what appeared to be solid stone. Drake squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then he noticed the rock face wasn't as solid as it appeared. There was a gap, an opening partially concealed by fallen branches and the angle of the stone. A cave entrance, maybe 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The dog disappeared into the opening without hesitation. Drake stood at the threshold, his heart hammering in his chest. Every practical instinct told him to be careful. Caves could be dangerous, unstable rock, sudden drops, animals sheltering inside. But the dog had led him here deliberately, and some deeper instinct told him this was important. He clicked on his flashlight and ducked through the entrance. The passage was short, maybe 10 feet, and then it opened into a larger space. Drake straightened up, sweeping his flashlight beam around, and felt his breath catch in his throat. He was standing in a chamber roughly 20 feet across and 12 feet high. The walls were natural rock, but the space had clearly been modified by human hands. The floor was level and dry. Against one wall, wooden shelving had been built into the stone. Stacked crates lined another wall, each one labeled in neat handwriting. A small table and chair sat in one corner, looking surreal in this underground space. The dog sat in the center of the chamber, calm again, watching Drake's reaction. Drake's hands shook as he moved the flashlight beam across the scene. This wasn't a natural formation someone had stumbled across. This was deliberate. Someone had created this space, stocked it, organized it. But who? And when? He walked to the nearest crate, reading the label. Food stores sealed 1989. His flashlight found others. Tools, medical supplies, clothing, emergency equipment. Everything was carefully marked, dated, preserved. On the table, he found a camping lantern. He turned it on, not really expecting it to work, but bright LED light flooded the chamber. The lantern was newer than the crates, battery-powered, and someone had maintained it. In the improved light, Drake saw more details. The shelving was professionally built. The crates were the kind used for long-term storage, sealed against moisture. Everything spoke of careful planning, of someone who had invested significant time and resources into creating this place. And on the table, beside the lantern, was a leather-bound journal. Drake picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was worn but well-maintained, and the pages inside were filled with neat handwriting. He opened to the first page and read, "My name is Harold Tobias, though I suppose by the time anyone reads this, I'll be long gone. If you've found this place, then you found it because you needed it. That's how I always intended it to work. This cache, this space, it's not for me. It never was. It's for whoever comes next, for whoever needs it most." Drake read the words again, his eyes blurring with sudden tears. He looked around the cave, at the supplies that represented months or years of preparation, at the dog sitting patiently in the center of it all, and he understood. This wasn't an accident. The dog hadn't led him here by chance. Someone, years ago, had built this place for exactly this moment, for exactly this purpose. For him. The storm began outside, rain drumming against the mountain, but Drake barely heard it. He stood in the cave, holding the journal, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, not yet, but the faint stirring of possibility. His hands tightened on the journal, and he whispered into the empty space, "Thank you." The dog's tail wagged once as if to say, "You're welcome. Now pay attention. There's more to see." Drake sat down on the floor, opened the journal to the second page, and began to read by the glow of the lantern. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cave, everything was dry and safe and waiting. His life, he realized, had just changed completely. He just didn't know how much yet. Drake spent the night in the cave. The storm outside was as fierce as he'd predicted, but inside the stone chamber, he was completely dry. He'd found blankets in one of the crates, thick wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar, and spread them on the sleeping platform that had been carved into the rock. The dog, which Drake was beginning to think of as his companion rather than just a stray, curled up near the entrance as if standing guard. By the light of the lantern, Drake read Harold Tobias's journal. The entries were detailed and personal, written in a steady hand that suggested patience and careful thought. Harold, he began thinking of the man by his first name, had been a geologist by training, someone who understood rock formations and mountain ecosystems. He'd discovered this cave in 1986 while surveying mineral deposits in the area, and something about it had captured his imagination. "I've spent my life studying the earth," Harold had written, "understanding how it shifts and changes, how it endures, and I've realized that I want to leave something that endures too. Not children, I never had any. Not wealth, I never cared about it. But this." Over the next several years, according to the journal entries, Harold had methodically stocked the cave. He'd bought supplies in small quantities from different towns, never drawing attention to himself. He'd sealed the food in airtight containers, chosen tools that would last, selected clothing in practical sizes. Everything had been thought through, planned, executed with care. "I don't know who will find this," one entry read. "Maybe no one ever will. Maybe it will sit here for 100 years and then collapse into the mountain. But if someone does find it, if you're reading this, then I want you to know. You're not stealing. This is yours. I built it for you." Drake read those words 3 times, his throat tight with emotion. He'd spent the last 6 months feeling like a thief every time he took food from a dumpster or camped on public land. The shame had become part of his identity, a weight he carried every waking moment. But Harold's words offered something different: permission, acceptance, the idea that needing help wasn't a moral failure. He set the journal down and walked to the crates stacked against the wall. The labels were all dated from the late 80s and early 90s. He chose one marked "Food Stores" and carefully pried it open. Inside, everything was vacuum-sealed or canned. Beans, rice, pasta, dried fruit, coffee, actual coffee. Drake picked up a can of soup, turned it over in his hands, checking the date. It was over 30 years old, but the seal was intact. The can showed no signs of rust or damage. Harold had done this right. He opened the can with a tool from his pocket, heated it over a small camping stove he found in the supplies, and ate the first hot meal he'd had in weeks. The soup was simple, chicken and vegetables, but it tasted like the finest restaurant meal he'd ever eaten. He had to stop himself from crying into the bowl. The dog watched him eat, and Drake realized the animal must be hungry too. "Come here," he said softly. "You led me here. Least I can do is share." He poured some soup into a smaller container and set it on the floor. The dog approached cautiously, sniffed it, then began to eat. It was the first time the animal had accepted anything from Drake, and somehow that felt significant, a bridge crossed, a trust established. "You need a name," Drake said, watching the dog eat. "Can't keep calling you the dog if we're going to be partners." The dog looked up at him, tail wagging slightly. Drake thought about it. The animal had led him here, had shown him the way when he was lost in more ways than one, had been his compass when he had no direction. "Compass," he said. "That's what I'll call you." The dog's tail wagged harder, as if in approval. They spent the next day exploring the cave's contents while the storm continued outside. Drake opened crate after crate, cataloguing everything in his mind. Tools, not just camping tools, but quality woodworking equipment. Chisels, saws, planes, all in a wooden case that looked handmade. Medical supplies, though most of the medications were expired. clothing that fit him reasonably well, a water filtration system that looked complicated but included detailed instructions. And more journals? Harold had kept writing over the years, documenting his visits to the cave, his thoughts about life and solitude and purpose. Drake read them chronologically, watching Harold's philosophy evolve. The man had clearly been lonely, despite his chosen solitude. He wrote about missing human connection, about the price of isolation, about wondering if his life had meaning. "I have no family to inherit this," Harold had written in 1991. "No children to carry on my name. My parents are gone. My brother and I haven't spoken in 15 years. I've chosen this isolation, but that doesn't make it easy. Sometimes I sit in this cave and wonder what it's all for, and then I remember it's for whoever comes next. That's the legacy. Not my name, but this act of preparation, this gift to a stranger." Drake understood that loneliness. He'd felt it every day for the past 6 months, and if he was honest with himself, for years before that. The divorce had been the beginning of it, and the job loss had just accelerated what was already happening. A slow withdrawal from the world, a gradual disappearance. But Harold's words offered a different perspective. Isolation didn't have to be the end of the story. It could be a chapter, a difficult season, something to move through rather than something that defined you forever. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. Sunlight filtered through the cave entrance, pale and tentative, and Drake made a decision. He couldn't keep living in the tent, not when this cave offered real shelter, but he also couldn't just move in without thinking it through. There were practical considerations. Morality aside, was it legal? Would someone come looking for this place? Should he try to find Harold's family? He spent that afternoon hiking back down to his tent. Compass followed, sure-footed on the wet rocks. Drake gathered a few essential items, his sleeping bag, some personal belongings, the photograph of his children he kept in his wallet, and carried them back up to the cave. That night, he made another decision. He found a small notebook in the supplies and began his own journal, documenting everything. "November 4th, he wrote. "My name is Drake Ramoray. I found this cave today, led here by a stray dog I've named Compass. I don't know if I have the right to use what's here, but I'm desperate and cold and tired of barely surviving. If Harold Tobias has family who comes looking for this, I'll account for everything I've used. I'll pay it back somehow. But for now, I'm accepting the gift he offered. I'm accepting help." He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "Thank you, Harold. I don't know if you can hear me, wherever you are, but thank you. You saved my life today. I promise I'll try to be worth saving." Compass lay beside him as he wrote, warm and solid and present. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars visible through the cave entrance. Inside, the lantern cast a warm glow over everything, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Drake felt something close to peace. He wasn't fixed, he wasn't healed. He had a long way to go before he could face his children or rebuild any kind of normal life. But he had shelter, he had food, he had a dog who'd led him here for reasons he still didn't fully understand. And he had Harold's journals, which felt like having a mentor, a guide, someone who understood what it meant to be lost and to search for meaning. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Drake closed the notebook, turned down the lantern, and lay down on the sleeping platform. Compass settled near his feet, a warm weight in the darkness. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out what came next. He'd begin planning, thinking beyond just the next meal or the next day. He'd start living instead of just surviving. But tonight, he simply rested, safe and warm, while the mountains stood guard around him. 2 weeks passed, and Drake's life transformed in ways he wouldn't have thought possible. He moved fully into the cave, using his tent as backup storage for items that didn't fit inside the main chamber. The transition felt natural, almost inevitable, as if the cave had been waiting for him all along. Each morning, he woke to Compass's gentle nudging, and each evening he fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the mountain passes. The routine he established was different from his survival routine at the tent. This wasn't about desperately scraping by, it was about building something sustainable, maybe even comfortable. He organized the supplies systematically, creating an inventory in his journal. Canned goods on one shelf, dried goods on another, tools in their designated area. Everything had a place, and the act of organizing gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. The woodworking tools changed everything. Drake had been a builder his entire adult life, and having quality tools in his hands again awakened something in him he'd thought was dead. The chisels were perfectly balanced, the saws still sharp after decades of careful storage. Harold had taken care of these tools the way Drake himself would have, and holding them felt like shaking hands with a kindred spirit across time. He started with small projects. The cave entrance needed better protection from wind and rain, so he built a doorframe using fallen timber from the forest and techniques he remembered from 30 years of construction work. It took him 3 days, working slowly and carefully, but when he finished, the door fit perfectly. It could be secured from inside or left open to let in light and air. Compass watched every step of the process, lying near the cave entrance while Drake measured and cut and fitted pieces together. Sometimes the dog would leave for an hour or two, disappearing into the forest, but it always returned. Drake found himself talking to Compass while he worked, explaining what he was doing, why certain joints worked better than others, how weight distribution mattered in any structure. "You're a good listener," Drake said one afternoon, holding up a piece of wood to check if it was level. "Better than most of the crews I used to work with." Compass's tail thumped against the stone floor. The work felt good, not just the physical satisfaction of creating something, but the mental clarity it brought. For months, Drake's mind had been a fog of shame and regret and desperate day-to-day survival. But now, with a project to focus on, with his hands doing what they'd been trained to do, the fog began to lift. He continued reading Harold's journals in the evenings. The second volume covered 1989 to 1991, and the entries became more philosophical as time went on. Harold wrote about his reasons for living alone, about a falling out with his brother over their father's estate, about choosing isolation as a form of self-protection. "I couldn't face going back," Harold had written. "Couldn't face the disappointment in their eyes, the questions about why I'd thrown away my career, why I'd walked away from everything. It seemed easier to just disappear, let them think what they wanted. At least out here, I only had to face myself." Drake read those words by lantern light and felt his chest tighten. He could have written them himself. The impulse to disappear, to avoid the judgment and pity, to choose isolation over humiliation, he understood it completely. He'd made the same choice with his own children. But Harold's later entries suggested regret about that choice. "Pride is a cold companion," one entry read. "It keeps you company, but it doesn't keep you warm. I wonder sometimes if I made a mistake, cutting everyone off. Maybe they would have understood. Maybe they would have helped, or maybe not. I'll never know now. Too much time has passed. Too many years of silence." Drake closed the journal and stared at the cave wall. Was that where he was headed? Years of silence, until it was too late to bridge the gap? His children were still young, still reachable. He hadn't burned those bridges completely, not yet. But every day he didn't call, every week that passed without contact, the gap grew wider. He pulled out his wallet and looked at the photograph he'd carried for years. Claire and Noah at a construction site, groundbreaking, both of them grinning, wearing hard hats he'd given them as a joke. Claire must have been 20, Noah 17. They'd been so proud of him that day, so excited to see him at work. What would they think if they could see him now, living in a cave, reading a dead man's journals, talking to a dog like it was his only friend? The thought should have filled him with shame, but instead he felt something else, a faint stirring of determination. Harold had ended up alone, his regrets recorded in journals that no one read until decades after his death. Drake didn't have to follow that same path. Not yet. Not while there was still time. He spent the next few days improving the cave's interior. Using Harold's tools, he built a better sleeping platform with a frame that kept him off the cold stone. He created a workspace near the entrance where he could sit and do detailed work in natural light. He fashioned hooks and shelves from scrap wood, making the space more livable, more like a home than a survival shelter. The physical work was meditative. His hands remembered skills he'd learned as a young man, and his body settled into the rhythm of measure, cut, fit, adjust. He'd forgotten how much he enjoyed this, the problem-solving aspect of construction, the satisfaction of seeing raw materials become something useful. Compass proved to be more than just a companion. The dog seemed to understand boundaries and routine. It would leave the cave each morning to hunt or explore, returning by midday. It kept watch at night, alert to any sounds that might signal danger. And it stayed close when Drake's mood turned dark, which still happened more often than he wanted to admit. One evening, as Drake sat carving a handle for a tool that needed repair, Compass suddenly stood and walked to the cave entrance. The dog's posture changed, alert, focused, ears forward. Drake set down his carving. "What is it?" He heard it, then voices on the trail. Hikers, probably. Though it was late in the season for casual hiking, he moved to the entrance and peered out. Two people were visible through the trees, a couple in their 30s, picking their way down the trail in the fading light. Drake's first instinct was to hide, to pull back into the cave and wait for them to pass. But then he stopped himself. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Harold had left this place for whoever needed it, and right now, that was him. He had as much right to be here as anyone else on this mountain. Still, he stayed in the shadows of the entrance, watching until the hikers disappeared down the trail. When they were gone, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'm not ready yet," he said to Compass. "To face people, to explain myself." The dog looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes, and Drake had the strangest feeling that Compass understood exactly what he meant. That night, he wrote in his journal about the encounter, about his instinct to hide, about the shame that still lived in him despite the improvement in his circumstances. Having shelter and food didn't erase the emotional damage of the past 6 months. He was still the man who'd lost everything, still the father who'd cut off contact with his children, still someone who felt more comfortable alone than among other people. But as he wrote, he realized something. Harold's journals had shown him that isolation was a choice, and that choices could be reconsidered. Harold had run out of time to reconnect with his family, but Drake hadn't. Not yet. "I'm not ready," Drake wrote, "but maybe someday I will be. Maybe that's what Harold really left me. Not just supplies and shelter, but time. Time to heal. Time to figure out who I am, without all the labels that defined me before. Time to become someone worth knowing again." He set down the pen and looked around the cave. The lantern cast warm light over everything he'd built and organized. Compass lay nearby, content and peaceful. Outside, the November night was cold and clear, but inside, everything was warm and safe. Drake wasn't fixed. He still had a long way to go. But for the first time in months, he could imagine a future that extended beyond the next day, the next meal, the next threat of winter weather. He could imagine, maybe, eventually, reaching out. That was something. That was progress. And for now, it was enough. Drake found the map on a cold morning in late November. He'd been reorganizing supplies, moving things around to create better flow in the cave, when he noticed a cylindrical container tucked behind one of the larger crates. It was a map tube, the kind surveyors and architects used, made of heavy-duty plastic with a screw-on cap. Inside was a large topographical map of the entire mountain region, printed on waterproof material and covered in Harold's neat handwriting. Notes and annotations filled the margins, and colored pencil marks highlighted specific features throughout the terrain. Drake spread the map across his workspace and spent an hour studying it. Harold had marked everything: water sources, game trails, areas with edible plants, natural shelters, dangerous sections to avoid. Each notation included details. Spring never runs dry, even in drought, or wild onions abundant in early summer, or rockfall zones stay clear after heavy rain. It was a treasure map of sorts, but instead of leading to gold, it led to survival resources. More than that, it led to knowledge, decades of observation and experience distilled into a single document. Drake traced the route from the cave to his old tent site, then followed the trail markers Harold had drawn. There was an entire network of paths Drake had never explored, connecting to water sources he didn't know existed, leading to areas Harold had identified as rich in berries or mushrooms or medicinal plants. One notation particularly caught his attention. About half a mile west of the cave, Harold had drawn a small circle and written, "Best spring, cold, clean, flows year-round. Build camp here if cave isn't viable." Drake studied the topography around that mark. The spring was at a slightly lower elevation, in a sheltered depression that would be protected from wind. If he could access that water source regularly, it would save him the longer hike down to the stream. "Want to go exploring?" he asked Compass. The dog's ears perked up immediately. They set out that afternoon, Drake carrying the map and a small pack with water and basic supplies. The temperature had dropped significantly, and patches of snow dotted the higher elevations, but the day was clear and bright. Compass ranged ahead, occasionally doubling back to check on Drake, clearly enjoying the expedition. Following Harold's map proved easier than Drake expected. The man had marked subtle features: a distinctively shaped boulder, a lightning-struck tree, a small cairn of rocks that made navigation straightforward. Within 30 minutes they found the spring. It bubbled up from between two rocks in a small clearing, creating a pool about 3 feet across before trickling away downhill. The water was crystal clear and cold enough to make Drake's teeth ache when he tested it. Harold had been right, this was significantly closer than the stream, and the flow was strong. Drake sat beside the spring, looking around the clearing. He could see why Harold had considered it as an alternative camp location. The area was sheltered, relatively flat, and the spring provided reliable water. If someone didn't know about the cave, this would be an ideal spot to establish a base. But Drake had the cave, which was infinitely better. Still, knowing about this spring opened up possibilities. He could cache supplies here, create a secondary location for emergencies, maybe even build a small shelter as a way station. Over the next 2 weeks, Drake used Harold's map to explore the surrounding area systematically. He found the berry patches Harold had marked bare now, but he noted their locations for summer. He located 3 more springs and 2 seasonal streams. He discovered a grove of pine trees that, according to Harold's notes, produced abundant nuts in the fall. Each discovery expanded his world. For 6 months, Drake had known only his tent site and the immediate area around it. His life had been confined to a few hundred yards of forest. But now, with Harold's map as a guide, he understood he was part of a much larger landscape, one rich with resources and possibilities. His physical health improved dramatically. With access to better food from Harold's supplies, with the security of warm shelter, with the daily exercise of exploration, Drake grew stronger. His face filled out, losing the gaunt look of months of near starvation. His movements became more confident, less marked by the constant wariness of someone in survival mode. Compass thrived too. The dog put on weight, its coat becoming shinier and healthier. It moved with the confidence of an animal that knew where its next meal was coming from, that had a safe den to return to. But even as Drake's physical situation improved, his emotional state remained complicated. He thought about his children constantly now. Where before the shame had been paralyzing, now it had transformed into something more painful, genuine longing. He missed them. He wanted to hear their voices, know what was happening in their lives, share with them what he was experiencing. But the gap felt impossibly wide. How did you call your adult children after months of silence and say, "Sorry I disappeared, but I'm living in a cave now and doing surprisingly well"? How did you bridge that kind of distance? He continued reading Harold's journals, now into the third volume covering 1993 to 1995. Harold's tone had shifted noticeably. The entries were shorter, more reflective, tinged with regret. "I saw my brother in town today," one entry read. "Just a glimpse across the street. He's aged, of course he has. It's been nearly 10 years. I almost called out to him, almost crossed the street to say hello. But what would I say? How do you apologize for a decade of silence? So I turned away, and he never knew I was there. Easier that way, safer, lonelier." Drake closed the journal and sat in the darkness of the cave. Harold's words were a warning, a glimpse of a possible future. The man had let pride and fear keep him isolated until it became impossible to break through. He'd had chances, moments when he could have reached out, and he'd let them pass. Drake pulled out the photograph of Claire and Noah, studied their faces in the lantern light. They were older now than they were in this picture. Claire would be almost 30, Noah in his mid-20s. Adults with their own lives, their own concerns, but they were still his children. That connection didn't disappear just because he'd been silent. "I'm going to call them," Drake said to Compass. "Not yet, not today, but soon. Before winter really sets in, before too much more time passes." The dog looked at him steadily, as if holding him to that promise. Drake spent the evening planning. He'd need to hike into town. Whitefish was the closest, about a 4-hour walk from the cave. He'd need to find a phone, maybe buy a cheap prepaid cell phone if he could afford it. He had a little money saved from before everything fell apart, kept in his wallet for emergencies. Was this an emergency? It felt like one. Not a crisis, exactly, but something urgent and important that couldn't wait any longer. He wrote in his journal that night, working through his fears and hopes. What if Claire and Noah didn't want to hear from him? What if they were angry, or worse, indifferent? What if they'd moved on, written him off as a lost cause? But what if they hadn't? What if they'd been worried, wondering where he was, hoping he was okay? He wouldn't know unless he tried. "Spring," Drake wrote in his journal. "I'll reach out in the spring, give myself the winter to prepare, to get stronger, to figure out what I want to say. I'll use these months to become someone worth hearing from, and when the snow melts and the trails clear, I'll go to town. I'll make the call." It was a plan. Maybe not a perfect one, but it was something concrete to work toward, a goal beyond simple survival. Drake looked around the cave at the organized supplies, the improvements he'd made, the sense of home he'd created in this unlikely place. He'd come so far in just a few weeks. Maybe, with a few more months, he could go even further. Maybe he could become the man his children remembered, or even better, someone new. Someone who'd been tested and hadn't broken. Someone who'd found his way back from the edge. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent in the darkness. Inside the cave, the lantern burned steady, and Compass slept peacefully, and Drake sat with his journal and his plans and the first real hope he'd felt in a very long time. Winter was coming, but he was ready for it. And when it passed, when spring arrived and the mountain came back to life, he'd be ready for that too. Ready to rejoin the world. Ready to reconnect, ready to try. The first heavy snow came in early December, and Drake watched it fall from the cave entrance with a sense of calm he hadn't expected. 6 months ago, a storm like this would have terrified him, the threat of freezing, of being buried, of running out of food. Now, he sat comfortably in his insulated shelter, fire crackling in the small stone fireplace he'd built, knowing he had weeks of supplies and no reason to worry. Compass lay beside him, watching the snow with mild interest, occasionally lifting his head when a branch creaked under the weight of ice. "We're in good shape," Drake said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Better than good, actually. It was true. He'd spent the past weeks preparing systematically for winter, firewood stacked and covered, extra water stored in containers, food supplies organized and rationed. He'd even created a small cold storage area near the cave entrance where temperatures stayed just above freezing, perfect for preserving fresh food if he managed to catch or forage anything. The storm lasted 3 days, and Drake spent the time reading Harold's later journals. He'd reached the final volume now, entries from 1993 through 1995, and the tone had become notably more somber. Harold wrote about his declining health, not anything catastrophic, but the gradual wearing down that came with age and isolation, joint pain that made the hike to the cave more difficult, a persistent cough that wouldn't quite go away, moments of dizziness that concerned him. But what struck Drake most were the entries about regret. "I found a box of old letters today," Harold had written in April 1994. "Letters I wrote to my brother years ago but never sent. Reading them now, I can't remember why I didn't mail them. Pride, probably. Fear of rejection. The usual reasons people cut themselves off from the ones who matter." Drake continued reading, his chest tightening with each entry. "I've decided to send them," the next entry said. "Better late than never, right? I'll mail them next time I go to town. Tell him I'm sorry for disappearing. Explain why I left. Maybe he'll understand. Maybe he won't. But at least I'll have tried." But then, several pages later, didn't send the letters. Got to the post office and just couldn't do it. What if he's angry? What if he doesn't respond? What if he's moved on and doesn't care anymore? The not knowing feels safer than the knowing. "I'll try again next month." Drake turned the pages, watching the pattern repeat. Harold would decide to reach out, would get close, then would talk himself out of it. The reasons changed. He wasn't ready. His brother was probably busy. Too much time had passed. It would be awkward, but the result was always the same. The letters stayed unmailed. The final entries in the journal were from late 1995. "I'm getting older," Harold had written. "Not old, not yet, but I can feel time moving faster now. The seasons blur together. I come to the cave less often. It's getting harder to make the hike. I need to make a decision about this place, about everything I've stored here, about the letters I still haven't sent." A few pages later, "I've made my peace with it. The cash will stay here, and someday someone will find it, someone who needs it more than any relative would. As for the letters, I'm keeping them here. Evidence, maybe. Proof that I cared, even if I couldn't show it when it mattered. Whoever finds this place will know I had regrets. Maybe that's worth something." The last entry was dated December 1995. "This will probably be my last visit. My knees can't take the climb anymore, and honestly, I don't have the energy. I'm at peace with how this ends. The cache is complete. My legacy, such as it is ready. If you're reading this, and I hope someone is, someday take what you need. Use it well, and learn from my mistakes. Don't let pride keep you from the people who matter. Don't wait until it's too late." Drake closed the journal carefully and sat in silence for a long time. He understood now why Harold had included the stipulation about the cave being for whoever needs it most. The man had built this place, not just as a practical survival cache, but as a monument to his own failures, a warning and a gift combined. On the 4th day, when the storm cleared, Drake made a decision. He went to the back of the cave where he'd stored Harold's personal effects, a small wooden box he'd found tucked away, separate from the main supplies. Inside were the letters Harold had mentioned, a dozen envelopes, addressed and stamped but never mailed, all to someone named Russell Tobias, presumably Harold's brother. Drake held them carefully, feeling the weight of all that unsent communication. Years of apologies and explanations and attempts at reconciliation, all trapped in paper and ink, never delivered. He couldn't mail them now. Russell Tobias might be dead himself by now, the letters were almost 30 years old. But Drake could do something else. He could make sure he didn't repeat Harold's mistake. That night, Drake found a blank notebook in the supplies and began writing his own letter. Not to mail, yet he wasn't ready for that, but to prepare, to organize his thoughts, to figure out what he wanted to say when the time came. "Dear Claire and Noah," he wrote, then stopped. The words felt inadequate, too formal for children he'd raised, too casual for the months of silence he'd maintained. He started again. "Claire and Noah, I know I've been gone a long time, and I know you probably don't understand why. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I want to try to explain." The letter grew slowly over several days. Drake wrote about the job loss, about the shame that had paralyzed him, about not wanting them to see him at his lowest. He wrote about the tent, about the isolation, about Compass leading him to the cave. He wrote about Harold and the cash, and what it had meant to find this place when he had nothing left. He didn't write about the cave's exact location that felt too complicated to explain in a letter. He didn't write about some of the harder moments, the days when he'd seriously considered just walking into the winter and not coming back. Those were his burdens to carry. But he wrote about missing them, about thinking of them every day, about wanting to be part of their lives again if they'd let him. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I'm not even asking for understanding. I just want you to know I'm okay, and I'm thinking of you, and when I'm ready, when I'm strong enough, I'm going to call you. I hope you'll answer. I hope we can talk. But even if you can't or won't, I want you to know I love you both. I always have. I always will." Drake read the letter over several times, making small changes, trying to get the tone right. It wasn't perfect, nothing could be after months of silence, but it was honest. That had to count for something. He folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box alongside Harold's unsent letters. A promise to himself, written but not yet delivered. Unlike Harold, though, Drake intended to actually send his message when the time came. The winter settled in properly after that. The temperatures dropped, the snow accumulated, and the mountain became a quiet, frozen world. Drake developed a routine that kept him busy and purposeful. Morning exercises to stay strong. Projects around the cave to improve the space. Reading by lantern light, writing in his journal. Talking to Compass, who proved to be an excellent listener. He carved small items from wood, a better handle for one of the tools, a bowl for Compass's food, a picture frame for the photograph of his children. The work kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Sometimes, during the long evenings, he'd take out Harold's letters and read them. Not to invade the man's privacy, Harold was gone, beyond caring, but to remind himself what happened when you waited too long. When you let fear and pride make your decisions for you. "I'm not going to be you," Drake said to the empty cave one night, holding one of Harold's letters. "No disrespect, but I'm going to do what you couldn't. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to try." Compass raised his head and looked at Drake with those calm, knowing eyes. "You think I can do it?" Drake asked. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. "Yeah," Drake said, "me too. Maybe." Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, and snow fell thick and heavy. But inside the cave, everything was warm and safe. Drake had food, shelter, purpose, and a plan. He had Harold's lessons and his own determination. Most importantly, he had time. The winter would be long, but it wouldn't last forever. Spring would come eventually, and when it did, Drake would be ready. Ready to leave the cave, ready to face the world, ready to reconnect with the family he'd lost. Harold had run out of time before he could make things right. Drake wouldn't make the same mistake. He put the letters away, banked the fire, and settled into his sleeping bag. compass curled up at the foot of his bed, warm and solid and reassuring. Tomorrow was another day, another step forward, and every day brought him closer to spring, closer to the moment when he'd finally send his message. Unlike Harold's letters, Drake's would reach their destination. He'd make sure of it. Mid-December brought a cold snap that froze the world solid. Drake spent most of his time inside the cave, venturing out only for necessities, firewood, water from the nearby spring, checking his perimeter. Compass stayed close, the dog's instincts telling it this was weather to respect. On the 5th day of the cold snap, Drake was moving firewood from his outdoor stack to the area near the fireplace when he noticed something odd. One of the stones in the cave floor, near the back wall, looked different. Not dramatically so, just slightly raised compared to the others around it. He'd walked past that spot dozens of times without noticing, but the angle of the light this morning made it visible, a thin shadow around the edge of the stone, suggesting it wasn't quite fitted the way the others were. Drake set down the firewood and crouched beside the stone. He ran his fingers around its edges and felt the gap. The stone was loose. His heart rate picked up. Harold had been meticulous about this place, about everything. A loose stone wasn't an accident or poor maintenance, it was deliberate. Using a flat tool from Harold's collection, Drake carefully pried up the stone. It came free with surprising ease, revealing a hollowed-out space beneath. And in that space, wrapped in plastic and preserved with the same care Harold had shown everything else, was a sealed metal container about the size of a shoebox. Drake's hands shook as he lifted it out. The container was heavy, clearly waterproof, and locked with a simple combination lock. But scratched into the stone floor beneath where it had rested were 3 numbers, the 15th of July, 2086. A date, Drake realized. The 15th of July, 1986. Probably when Harold had first found this cave. He tried the combination. The lock clicked open. Inside the container, Drake found 3 things. First, there was cash. Thick stacks of $100 bills, wrapped in plastic, carefully preserved. He didn't count it immediately, couldn't. His hands were shaking too badly, but there had to be thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. Second, there were legal documents, a property deed, folded and stored in a protective sleeve. Drake unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the details. 80 acres, purchased in 1986, including this entire ridge and the cave itself. Owner, Harold James Tobias. No heir designation, no transfer of ownership. Third, there was a sealed envelope with writing on the outside. To whoever finds this place. Drake sat on the cold stone floor, the contents of the container spread around him, trying to process what he was looking at. This wasn't just a survival cache, this was a complete life restart, packaged and waiting for someone desperate enough to need it. He opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a letter in Harold's handwriting, dated December 1995, the same month as the last journal entry. If you're reading this, the letter began, then you've found not just the supplies, but this final piece of what I'm leaving behind. I debated whether to make this easy to find or difficult. I chose difficult because I wanted to make sure whoever discovered it was someone who truly needed it, someone who'd spent time here, who'd earned it through persistence and necessity. The money represents my life savings, $43,000 to be exact, not a fortune, but enough to make a real difference for someone starting over. I never married, never had children, lived simply. This money sat in a bank, earning minimal interest, serving no purpose. Now, it can serve a real purpose, helping someone who needs help. The property deed is even more important. This land is mine, purchased legally in 1986. I paid cash, have all the proper documentation, but I never designated an heir. The state would eventually claim it through escheat laws, turn it into public land or sell it at auction. I don't want that. I want whoever finds this place to have it, I want someone who's desperate, someone who's fallen through the cracks, someone the world has given up on. I want that person to have a chance, a real chance. Not just survival, but a foundation to rebuild. Is it legal? Probably not, technically. I'm not a lawyer, but I've written this letter as clearly as I can, stating my intentions. I give all of this, the money, the property, everything in this cave, to whoever reads these words. The person who needed it enough to follow a trail to a hidden cave in the middle of nowhere. Will it hold up in court? I don't know, but I've included the deed, documentation of the purchase, and this letter. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's not. You'll have to decide if you want to fight for it. What I do know is this. I spent years preparing this place, and I spent the last decade of my life regretting that I didn't have someone to share it with, to pass it to help. You're that person now. Don't let laws made by comfortable people in warm offices stop you from accepting what you need. Use this wisely. Build something here. Create a life. And please, learn from my mistakes. Don't let pride and fear keep you isolated. Reach out to the people who matter. Send the letters. Make the calls. Don't end up alone like I did, with regrets that outweigh accomplishments. I'm 71 years old as I write this. My health is failing, though not dramatically. I probably have a few more years, but I won't be coming back to this cave. My hiking days are over. This is my final preparation, my last arrangement. If no one finds this for decades, so be it. The money will still be good. The deed will still be valid. The cave will wait. But if you're reading this now, recently after I've gone, then know that somewhere an old man is glad his work mattered. Glad someone found it. Glad he could help, even if we never meet. Take it. All of it. You found it because you needed it. That's enough. Good luck, friend. Build something worth building. It was signed simply, Harold James Tobias, the 18th of December, 1995. Drake read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new waves of emotion. Disbelief, gratitude, fear, hope. This wasn't just supplies anymore. This was land ownership. This was enough money to actually restart a life, not just survive day to day. But it was also complicated. Harold's intentions were clear, but the legal situation was murky. Could Drake really claim this property? Would it hold up if challenged? What if Harold had family after all, distant relatives who'd contest this? He looked at the money again. $43,000. With that, he could hire a lawyer, properly file claims, navigate the legal system. He could buy proper building materials, create a real cabin instead of just living in a cave. He could afford to take time to do things right instead of constantly scrambling for the next meal. He could call his children without feeling like a complete failure. Could invite them to visit, show them he'd found his feet again, prove he was worth reconnecting with. Compass walked over and sat beside Drake, leaning against his leg. The dog seemed to sense the magnitude of the moment. "This changes everything," Drake said quietly. "But I don't know if I can do it. Don't know if I have the right." He looked at Harold's letter again, at the line. That's enough. Was it enough? Could intention override legal technicalities? Could Drake really take ownership of 80 acres and $43,000 based on a letter and his own desperate circumstances? He spent the rest of the day sitting in the cave, the container's contents spread before him, thinking through possibilities and problems. The practical part of his mind, the part that had managed construction sites and solved logistical problems, began making lists. He'd need a lawyer, probably one who specialized in property law. He'd need to research escheat laws, adverse possession, Harold's actual legal status. He'd need to be prepared for complications. But the emotional part of his mind kept returning to Harold's words. Don't let laws made by comfortable people in warm offices stop you from accepting what you need. As darkness fell and Drake lit the lantern, he made his decision. He would try. He'd take the money, hire a lawyer, file the proper claims. He'd fight for this property if he had to, present Harold's letter as evidence of intent, make the case that he was honoring a dying man's wishes. And if it didn't work, if the courts ruled against him, at least he'd have tried. At least he wouldn't have let fear and doubt stop him from accepting help when it was offered. He packed the money back into the container, along with the deed and letter, and hid it in a different location under his sleeping platform, wrapped in additional plastic. The money wouldn't do any good until spring anyway, until the trails cleared and he could hike to town. But knowing it was there, knowing what it represented, changed everything. Drake pulled out his journal and wrote, "Found Harold's final gift today, money, property deed, and a letter that might change my life if I'm brave enough to accept it. Spring can't come fast enough." Outside, the wind howled through the frozen night. But inside, Drake felt something he hadn't felt since before he lost his job, before his world collapsed. He felt like he had a future. January and February passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Drake threw himself into getting ready for his journey to town, treating it with the same methodical planning he'd once applied to construction projects. This wasn't just a supply run, this was the moment when he'd stepped back into the world he'd left behind, and everything had to go right. He started with his appearance. Using scissors from the supplies and a small mirror, he trimmed his beard from wild mountain man to something more presentable. He couldn't do much about his hair except cut it shorter and keep it clean. He looked older than he remembered, weathered, with deeper lines around his eyes, but he looked capable. That was something. The clothing was next. Harold's cache included practical outdoor wear, and Drake selected the best pieces. Sturdy boots that actually fit, thermal layers, a heavy coat that was worn but serviceable. Nothing fashionable, but nothing that screamed homeless either. He needed to look like someone who could walk into a lawyer's office and be taken seriously. He practiced what he'd say, rehearsing conversations with Compass as his audience. "My name is Drake Ramoray. I need legal advice about a property claim." Too stiff. "I've come into possession of a property deed and need help establishing ownership." Better, but vague. "I found something in the mountains. Something valuable. And I need to know if I can legally claim it." Compass tilted his head, and Drake laughed, despite his nervousness. "Yeah, I know. I sound like I found treasure. I guess I kind of did." The most important preparation was organizing his documentation. Drake created a folder using materials from the cave, carefully placing Harold's deed, the final letter, and his own journal entries, documenting his discovery. He included the first journal volume, where Harold explained his intentions, everything that might help prove Harold's wishes and Drake's right to accept them. He took $5,000 from the stash, leaving the rest hidden in the cave, enough to hire a lawyer, buy essentials, handle emergencies, but not so much that losing it would be catastrophic. The bills were old but still legal tender, and Drake separated them into smaller amounts so he wouldn't draw attention by pulling out huge stacks. In early March, the weather began to shift. The days grew longer, temperatures rose above freezing during daylight hours, and the snow started its slow melt. The trails remained icy and treacherous, but they were passable for someone careful and determined. Drake made a decision. He'd go to town on the first clear week of March. No more delays, no more excuses. Harold's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't wait until it's too late." He spent his evenings working on a small woodworking project, a box carved from a single piece of pine, with a fitted lid and simple but elegant lines. Inside, he placed the photograph of Claire and Noah, Harold's final letter, and the first letter he'd written to his children, still unsent, still waiting for the right moment. The box represented everything: his past, his present, his potential future. He planned to take it with him to town, a tangible reminder of why he was doing this. "This is for them," he told Compass one evening, holding the completed box. "All of this, the property, the rebuilding, everything. So I have something to offer them besides excuses and apologies, so they can see their father didn't just give up. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. Drake continued his physical preparation, taking longer hikes to build his stamina. The walk to Whitefish was roughly 15 miles, manageable, but challenging after months of staying close to the cave. He needed to be able to make the journey without arriving exhausted and unable to think clearly. Compass accompanied him on these practice hikes, the dog's presence both encouraging and calming. Drake had decided to bring Compass to town. The dog was well behaved, and having a companion would make the journey less daunting. Besides, Compass had led him to the cave in the first place. It seemed right that the dog should be part of what came next. One afternoon in mid-March, during a practice hike, Drake encountered other people for the first time in months. A pair of hikers, a man and woman in their 30s, making their way up the trail with expensive gear and energy to spare. They passed within 10 feet of him. "Beautiful day," the man said, nodding in greeting. Drake's throat tightened. "Yes," he managed. "It is." "Your dog?" the woman asked, smiling at Compass. "Yeah, his name's Compass." "That's unique. Well, enjoy your hike." They continued past, and Drake stood rooted to the trail, his heart pounding. Such a simple interaction, seconds of polite conversation, but it felt monumental. He'd spoken to strangers. He'd been seen and acknowledged, and treated like a normal person, rather than someone to avoid or pity. It was a small victory, but it mattered. That evening, Drake made his final decision about timing. The weather forecast he'd found a battery-powered weather radio in the supplies called for clear conditions through the end of the week. It was time. He spent the next day preparing the cave for his absence. He banked the fire carefully, secured all supplies, and left detailed notes in case he didn't make it back for some reason. Not that he expected disaster, but construction work had taught him to always plan for contingencies. He packed a small backpack with essentials, the folder of documents, the wooden box, some food and water, basic first aid supplies, and enough money for immediate needs. The pack was light enough to carry comfortably, but heavy enough to remind him this was real, this was happening. That night, he barely slept. He lay on his sleeping platform, staring at the cave ceiling, playing through scenarios. What if the lawyer refused to help? What if someone had already claimed the property? What if he got to town and his courage failed? But also, what if it worked? What if he could legally claim this land, build something here, create a life worth having? What if his children agreed to visit, to give him a chance to explain? The unknowns were terrifying, but they were also thrilling in a way Drake hadn't felt in years. He was taking action, making choices, moving forward instead of just surviving day to day. At dawn, Drake rose and went through his morning routine one last time. He ate a good breakfast, double-checked his pack, and dressed in his best clothes. He looked at himself in the small mirror and saw someone different from the man who'd been living in a tent 6 months ago. Still weathered, still marked by hardship, but standing straighter, eyes clearer, purpose visible in his posture. "Ready?" he asked Compass. The dog stood immediately, tail wagging. Drake took one last look around the cave, his home, his sanctuary, his salvation for the past months. Then he shouldered his pack, secured the door he'd built, and started down the trail. The morning was cold but clear, the sun just breaking over the eastern peaks. Snow still covered the higher elevations, but the main trail was passable, muddy in places but navigable. Drake moved carefully, Compass ranging ahead and circling back, both of them falling into the rhythm of the journey. As they descended, Drake's mind wandered to what lay ahead. The town would be overwhelming after months of isolation. He'd need to find the lawyer's office if the man was still practicing. He'd need to find a phone, call his children, somehow bridge the gap his silence had created. Each step took him farther from the safety of the cave and closer to the uncertainty of the world he'd left behind. But for the first time in a long time, Drake wasn't running away from something. He was walking toward something, toward possibility, toward reconnection, toward a future. Hours passed. His legs ached, his breath came harder with the exertion, but he kept moving. The trail gradually descended, the forest transitioning from high alpine to lower elevation pines to mixed hardwoods. Signs of civilization began appearing: trail markers, footprints from recent hikers, eventually the distant sound of traffic. By early afternoon, Drake could see the edge of town through the trees. Whitefish, Montana population a few thousand, small enough to be manageable, large enough to have the services he needed. He stopped at the tree line, Compass sitting beside him, both of them looking at the town spread out below. "This is it," Drake said quietly. "No turning back now." Compass looked up at him with those calm, steady eyes, and Drake felt his courage steady. The dog had led him this far. He could take the next steps himself. Drake adjusted his pack, straightened his shoulders, and walked out of the forest into town. The real test was about to begin. The town felt overwhelming. Drake stood on the sidewalk of Main Street, Compass at his side, trying to adjust to the sensory assault. Cars moving past, their engines loud after months of hearing only wind and water. People everywhere, walking, talking, laughing, living their normal lives. The smell of coffee from a nearby cafe, exhaust fumes, someone's perfume carried on the breeze. Everything was too much and not enough, all at once. "We're okay," Drake muttered to himself, to Compass, to anyone who might be listening. "We can do this." He needed a phone first. Needed to call Claire and Noah before his courage failed. A payphone would be ideal, old-fashioned, but some small towns still had them. He spotted one outside a gas station and walked toward it, each step feeling more difficult than the hike down the mountain. The phone was there, weathered but functional. Drake pulled out coins from his pocket. He'd brought a handful specifically for this and lifted the receiver. His hands shook as he dialed the number he'd memorized years ago, Claire's cell phone. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Her voice professional and distant. "You've reached Claire Ramoray. Please leave a message." The beep sounded like judgment. "Claire." "It's your dad," Drake said, his voice rough. "I know it's been a long time. I know you probably don't understand why I disappeared. I'm in Whitefish, Montana. I'm okay. I'm more than okay, actually. I found something that's helped me get back on my feet. I'd really like to talk to you. I'm going to try calling again tomorrow. I'm staying in town for a few days. I love you." He hung up and immediately dialed Noah's number. Also, voicemail. He left a similar message, trying to sound steady and sane and like a father worth hearing from. When he hung up the second time, his legs felt weak. He sat on the curb next to Compass, his head in his hands, trying to process what he'd just done. After months of silence, after all the fear and shame, he'd actually made the calls. There was no taking them back now. A woman walking by glanced at him with concern. "Are you all right?" Drake looked up. "Yeah, just tired. Long walk. There's a diner down the street if you need to rest. They're dog-friendly on the patio." "Thank you." She smiled and continued on, and Drake felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. Kindness existed in the world. People still helped strangers. He'd forgotten that during his isolation. He found the diner a small place with a hand-painted sign and checkered curtains, and took a seat on the outdoor patio. Compass settled at his feet, patient and calm. A waitress appeared within minutes, middle-aged and friendly, with tired eyes that suggested she'd worked this job for years. "What can I get you?" "Coffee," Drake said. "And whatever your special is." "Breakfast special still running. 2 eggs, bacon, toast, hash browns." "That sounds perfect." She noticed Compass. "Beautiful dog. What's his name?" "Compass." "That's a great name. I'll get your order in." Drake sat in the weak March sunshine, drinking coffee that tasted like civilization, and watched the town move around him. Normal people doing normal things. Going to work, running errands, meeting friends for lunch. A world that had kept spinning while he'd been living in a cave. The food arrived, and Drake ate slowly, savoring every bite. Real eggs, cooked on a real stove, bacon that was crispy and salty, toast with butter. He gave Compass a piece of bacon under the table, and the dog accepted it gratefully. "Long trip?" the waitress asked, refilling his coffee. "You could say that. Where you headed?" Drake hesitated. "Actually, I'm looking for a lawyer, Oswald Finch. Do you know if he's still practicing?" Her face lit up. "Oz? Oh, sure, his office is on Baker Street, above the pharmacy. He's been there forever. Good man." Drake felt his heart rate pick up. The lawyer from Harold's journals was real, was still here, was still practicing. It felt like a sign, like everything was falling into place. Is he usually there in the afternoons? Most days. He keeps regular hours. You want the address? Baker Street, above the pharmacy. Got it. Thank you. She smiled and moved to check on other customers, and Drake finished his meal. The food sat heavy and warm in his stomach, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar after months of lighter meals. He paid with cash, tipped generously, and stood up. "Ready for round two?" he asked Compass. The dog stood, shaking out his coat. Drake found Baker Street easily. The town wasn't large enough to get lost in. The pharmacy was right where the waitress said it would be, with narrow stairs leading to a second-floor office. A simple sign on the door read, "Oswald Finch, attorney at law, by appointment preferred." Drake knocked anyway. He'd come this far. He wasn't turning back now. "Come in," a voice called from inside. Drake opened the door to a small, cluttered office, files stacked on every surface, law books lining the walls, a desk buried under papers. Behind the desk sat a man in his 70s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. "Help you?" Oswald Finch asked, looking up over reading glasses. Drake stepped inside, suddenly aware of how he must look weathered, nervous, carrying all his possessions in a backpack. But he'd come too far to hesitate now. "My name is Drake Ramoray," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need legal advice about a property claim." Oswald gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit down. Tell me about it." Drake sat, carefully placing his backpack beside the chair. Compass settled at his feet. He took a breath and began. "I found a cave in the mountains. Inside, there were supplies left by a man named Harold Tobias, along with a property deed and a letter stating his intentions to leave everything to whoever found it." Oswald's expression shifted from polite interest to intense focus. He leaned forward, removing his glasses. "Harold Tobias. I remember him. Hadn't heard that name in decades." He studied Drake carefully. "You found his cash?" "Yes, sir." "And he left you a letter stating his intentions?" Drake pulled out the folder and handed it across the desk. "All the documentation is here. The deed, his letter, my journal entries documenting when and how I found it." Oswald opened the folder and began reading. The office fell silent except for the rustle of papers and the ticking of a wall clock. Drake's heart hammered in his chest. This moment would determine everything, whether he had a legitimate claim or was just a desperate man grasping at impossible hope. Finally, Oswald looked up. His expression was thoughtful, measuring. "This is complicated," he said slowly, "but it's not impossible. Harold consulted me back in 1990 about estate planning. I advised him to set up a proper trust, designate an heir, do everything legally. He said he'd think about it." Oswald tapped the papers. "Looks like he chose a different path." "Can I claim the property?" Drake asked. "Legally?" Oswald leaned back in his chair, considering. "It'll take work. Court petitions, probably a hearing. We'd need to show Harold's clear intent, prove no legitimate heirs exist, make a case for adverse possession or his explicit gifting. But yes, Mr. Ramoray, I think we can make this work." Drake felt tears prick his eyes. "Really? Really? It'll take time, probably several months, and there are no guarantees. But you've got a solid case." Oswald smiled slightly. "Harold was a good man, Sounds like he found the right person to leave this to. I can pay, Drake said quickly. I have money, from what Harold left. We'll work something out. But first tell me the whole story. Start from the beginning. So Drake did. He talked about losing his job, about the tent, about Compass leading him to the cave, about reading Harold's journals and understanding the gift he'd been given, about wanting to rebuild his life, to reconnect with his children, to make something meaningful out of the second chance he'd received. Oswald listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his expression sympathetic and professional. When Drake finished, the lawyer nodded slowly. All right, here's what we'll do. Drake spent 2 days in Whitefish, and they were the most disorienting days of his life since leaving the cave. Oswald had arranged for him to stay at a small motel on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it had a bed, hot water, and a door that locked. The lawyer had also agreed to take his case, drawing up a payment plan that was fair and manageable with Harold's money. We'll file a petition with the court, Oswald had explained. Make the case that Harold's intent was clear, that no legitimate heirs have come forward in nearly 30 years, and that you've been occupying and maintaining the property. It's not a slam dunk, but it's solid. Drake had signed the retainer agreement with shaking hands, still unable to quite believe this was happening. The motel room felt enormous after months in the cave. Drake stood in the shower for 30 minutes that first night, letting hot water pour over him until the small tank ran cold. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, really looked, for the first time in months, and saw a stranger, thinner, older, weathered by exposure and hardship, but also stronger somehow. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Determination, maybe. Or survival. Compass adapted to the motel with surprising ease, claiming a spot on the floor near the bed and settling in as if he'd always lived indoors. Drake bought dog food from a local store the first time Compass had eaten commercial kibble instead of scraps and game, and the dog seemed to approve. But the hardest part was the waiting. Drake called Claire and Noah again the next morning. Claire's phone rang through to voicemail. Noah's did the same. He left messages both times, trying to sound calm and rational, giving them the motel's phone number, asking them to call back when they could. The silence felt crushing. He spent the afternoon walking around town with Compass, trying to reacclimatize to being around people. He bought a cheap prepaid cell phone from a drugstore. The clerk had to show him how to set it up, technology having advanced since he'd last owned one, and programmed in Claire and Noah's numbers. You'll get 10 days of service with this plan, the clerk explained. After that, you can buy more minutes. 10 days. Drake hoped that would be enough. That evening, back at the motel, he sat on the bed and stared at the phone. What if they never called back? What if months of silence had been too much, and they'd written him off completely? He was spiraling into dark thoughts when the phone rang. Drake grabbed it so fast he nearly dropped it. Hello? Dad? Claire's voice, cautious and uncertain. Drake's throat closed up. He couldn't speak for a moment, just held the phone and tried not to cry. Dad, are you there? I'm here, he managed. Claire, God, it's good to hear your voice. Silence on the other end, heavy with months of unspoken words. Then, where have you been? We thought you might be dead. We filed a missing person report. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't really cover 8 months of silence. She sounded hurt more than angry, and somehow that was worse. Drake wiped his eyes with his free hand. You're right, it doesn't, but I want to explain. Can I try to explain? Another pause. I'm listening. So Drake told her. Not everything, not the darkest moments, not the times he'd seriously considered giving up, but the broad strokes. Losing the job, losing the house, ending up in a tent because he couldn't face asking for help, finding Compass, following him to the cave, discovering Harold's cache. You've been living in a cave. Claire's voice was somewhere between disbelief and concern. A well-stocked cave. with supplies and shelter. It saved my life, Claire. Literally. Why didn't you call? Why didn't you reach out? Pride, Drake said simply. Shame. I didn't want you to see me like that. Didn't want you to have to worry about your father living on the street. So instead, we worried you were dead. I know. I was wrong. I'm sorry. He heard her take a shaky breath. Noah's going to want to talk to you too. He's been a mess. I called him, left messages. He's in Portland, different time zone. He probably hasn't checked yet. Claire paused. Dad, are you really okay now? Or are you just saying that? Drake looked around the motel room, thought about Oswald and the property claim, about the money hidden in the cave and the future he was trying to build. I'm getting there, he said honestly. I'm not fixed, but I'm better than I was. I found something in that cave besides supplies. I found time to figure out who I am without all the things that used to define me. And I found reasons to keep going. What reasons? You and Noah, wanting to be someone you could be proud of again, wanting to have something to offer you besides apologies. Claire's voice softened. Dad, we never stopped caring about you. We just wanted to know you were alive. I know that now. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. They talked for another hour. Claire told him about her work, about the physical therapy clinic where she'd been promoted to senior therapist. She told him about Noah's job with a tech startup, about his new apartment in Portland. She filled in the gaps of the months Drake had been gone, painting a picture of their lives continuing without him. It hurt to hear how much he'd missed, but it also gave him hope. They'd built good lives, they were doing well, they didn't need him to rescue them or provide for them. They just needed him to be present, to be honest, to be their father. Can we see you? Claire asked finally. Noah and I could come to Montana. This weekend, maybe. Drake's heart raced. You'd do that? Of course we would. You're our dad. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. They made plans. Claire would call Noah, coordinate schedules. They'd drive up on Saturday, 3 days away, meet at the diner where Drake had eaten, talk in person, figure out what came next. When they finally said goodbye, Drake sat holding the phone, overwhelmed by gratitude and terror in equal measure. They were coming. His children were actually coming to see him. He called Noah next, catching him just as he was getting home from work. The conversation was similar, hurt and relief mixed together, questions and explanations, and ultimately agreement to come to Montana on Saturday. I can't believe you've been living in a cave, Noah said, and Drake could hear the smile in his voice despite everything. That's the most dad thing ever. Of course you found a way to survive in the mountains. It wasn't exactly planned. Still, you're tougher than you gave yourself credit for. When Drake finally put the phone down, he realized Compass was watching him with those calm, knowing eyes. They're coming, Drake said. They're actually coming. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. Drake pulled out the wooden box he'd carved and opened it. The photograph of Claire and Noah looked back at him, younger versions of the people he'd just spoken to. He'd been so afraid they'd reject him that the silence had been too long, the gap too wide. But they were coming. They still cared. There was still a chance to rebuild. He had 3 days to prepare, to figure out what he'd say when they met face to face. 3 days to get ready for the most important conversation of his life. Drake closed the box carefully and set it on the nightstand. Then he lay back on the bed, Compass settling at his feet, and for the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. His children were coming. He had a lawyer working on his case. He had a home waiting for him in the mountains and a future that was starting to look possible. Harold's gift had been more than supplies and shelter. It had been time to heal, time to find himself, time to become someone worth knowing again. And now, finally, Drake was ready to show his children who that person was. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Drake woke early, nerves and anticipation making sleep impossible after 5 in the morning. He showered, dressed in his best clothes, and spent 30 minutes pacing the motel room while Compass watched with patient understanding. They were meeting at the diner at 10 o'clock. Drake arrived 15 minutes early, taking the same outdoor table he'd sat at days before. He ordered coffee and waited, watching every car that pulled into the parking lot, his heart jumping each time. At exactly 10 o'clock, a blue sedan pulled in. Drake stood, his legs suddenly unsteady, as two people emerged. Claire stepped out first, taller than he remembered, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater, practical and comfortable, and when she saw him, her hand went to her mouth. Noah climbed out of the passenger side, broader in the shoulders than Drake's memory held, wearing a jacket and looking uncertain but determined. For a moment, they all just stood there, separated by 20 feet of parking lot and 8 months of silence. Then Claire walked forward, and Drake met her halfway. They collided in a hug that felt like coming home. She was crying, and so was he. And then Noah was there too, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Dad," Claire whispered. "You're really okay." "I'm really okay," Drake said, his voice breaking. They held each other for a long time, right there in the diner parking lot, while other customers walked around them and Compass sat patiently by the table, his tail wagging. When they finally pulled apart, all three of them were wiping their eyes. Claire laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and relief. "You look different," she said. "Thinner, but stronger somehow." "I am stronger," Drake said, "in ways I didn't expect." They sat at the table, ordered food they barely touched, and talked. Drake told them the full story this time, holding nothing back. The tent, the desperation, the shame that had kept him from reaching out. Compass appearing like a guardian angel. The cave and everything Harold had left behind. "So you own 80 acres now?" Noah asked, his eyes wide. "Maybe, if the court approves the claim. My lawyer thinks it's likely, but it'll take months." "What are you going to do with it?" Claire asked. Drake had been thinking about this question for weeks. "Build a cabin first, something real and permanent. I've got the skills, and now I have the resources. Make it a home, not just a survival shelter. And then," Noah prompted, "then maybe help other people. Veterans, people who've lost everything, anyone who needs a second chance, like I did. Harold built that cache for whoever needed it most. I want to honor that. Pay it forward." Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That sounds like you, the you I remember." They spent hours at that table, talking about everything and nothing. Claire told him about a patient she'd helped walk again after a car accident. Noah explained his work with software in terms Drake could almost understand. They showed him photos on their phones, their apartments, their friends, their lives, and Drake showed them the wooden box he'd carved, opening it to reveal the photograph and Harold's letter. "You made this?" Noah asked, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "Harold left tools. I remembered how to use them." "It's beautiful," Claire said softly. "You were always good with your hands." After lunch, Drake drove them up the mountain in a truck he'd rented for the day. The trail was still muddy from snowmelt, but passable. Compass rode in the back, tongue hanging out happily, while Drake navigated the rough road he'd walked so many times. When they reached the trailhead, they hiked the last mile to the cave. Claire and Noah were awed by the location, the view of the valley below, the mountains rising on all sides, the sense of being removed from the ordinary world. "This is incredible," Noah said, turning in a slow circle. Drake opened the cave door and showed them inside. They explored everything, the organized supplies, Harold's journals, the sleeping platform Drake had built, the improvements he'd made over months of living there. "You really survived here," Claire said, touching the stone walls with wonder. "You really made a home. Harold made it possible. I just accepted the gift." They sat at the cave entrance as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. Compass lay between them, content to be included in the family reunion. Drake pointed out features of the landscape, showed them Harold's map, explained his plans for where the cabin would go. "Can we help?" Claire asked. "When you start building, I mean. I could come up in the summer. Bring supplies. I can take time off work," Noah added. "Help with construction. I'm not as skilled as you, but I can follow directions." Drake looked at his children, these adults who'd grown and thrived without him, who'd built their own lives, who were offering to be part of his future anyway, and felt his throat tighten. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." As evening approached, they hiked back down to the truck. Drake drove them to their car, and they stood in the parking lot, delaying the goodbye none of them wanted. "We'll call every week," Claire promised. "And we'll come back next month. Start planning the cabin properly." "I'll be here," Drake said. "I'm not disappearing again." "You better not," Noah said, but he was smiling. More hugs, more tears, and then they were driving away. Drake stood watching until their car disappeared around a curve, then looked down at Compass. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." The dog's tail wagged in agreement. Drake returned the rental truck and walked back to the motel with Compass. He had one more night in town, one more meeting with Oswald to sign papers, and then he'd return to the cave. But it felt different now. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was living. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Saw my children today. They still love me. They want to help build the cabin. Harold's gift keeps giving, not just in supplies and property, but in the time and space it gave me to become someone worthy of a second chance. I came to the mountains broken. I'm leaving whole." 6 months later, Drake stood in front of a nearly completed cabin, wiping sweat from his forehead. Claire and Noah were there, helping hammer the last boards into place. The structure was solid, well built, overlooking the valley with the cave nearby as a reminder of where he'd started. Compass dozed in the shade, older now but still faithful, still the guardian who'd led Drake to salvation. The court had approved his property claim 3 weeks earlier, 80 acres, legally his, with Harold's letter accepted as evidence of clear intent. Oswald had called with the news, and Drake had sat in the cave and cried with relief and gratitude. Now he had a home, a real home, one he'd built with his own hands and his children's help. He had purpose plans to create a program for homeless veterans, to offer others what Harold had offered him. He had family again, not perfect but present, not healed completely but healing. And he had Compass, who'd started this whole journey by refusing to leave a broken man alone in the woods. As the sun set that evening, Drake, Claire and Noah sat on the cabin's new porch, looking out over the mountains. A photograph sat on the mantel inside all 4 of them together, Drake and his children and Compass smiling in front of their work. "To Harold," Claire said, raising a bottle of water in toast. "To Harold," Drake and Noah echoed. "And to second chances," Drake added quietly. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and Drake thought about the journey that had brought him here. From desperation to hope, from isolation to connection, from barely surviving to truly living. Sometimes life takes everything from you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a stray dog leads you to exactly what you need. Not just shelter or supplies, but purpose, a reason to keep going. Harold had left more than provisions. He'd left the gift of time, of healing, of becoming whole again. Drake had spent the rest of his life earning that gift, and it had been worth every moment.